All right. Well, how about the question of generalization in space and time? Do people judge things that they take to be wrong now to also be wrong in the past? To explore that, here's one of the examples we used. 300 years ago, whipping was a common practice in most navies and on cargo ships. There were no laws against it, and almost everyone thought that whipping was an appropriate way to discipline sailors who disobey orders or were drunk on duty. Mr. Williams was an officer on a cargo ship 300 years ago. One night, while at sea, he found a sailor drunk at a time when the sailor should have been on watch. After the sailor sobered up, Williams punished the sailor by giving him 5 lashes with a whip. The other question, now each subject is presented with both questions, although only 2, by the way, so if you get this 2, you don't get the corporal punishment one. Had one additional scenario where we looked at the relativism of distance, that one, by the way, focusing on slavery of all things. And we also had 5 additional scenarios where we looked at authority independence. And in each case, the data were entirely similar. And these, by the way, are now available, published in Mind and Language a few months ago. Well, we maintain that these findings pose a serious challenge to the one remaining generalization, which claims that harm norms evoke the signature moral response pattern. Indeed, what I want to suggest to you is that when we go beyond the narrow range of schoolyard transgressions that have been used in previous studies, many participants think that rules prohibiting harmful actions are neither authority independent nor general in scope. Well, where has this gotten us? What's the upshot of all of this? I think where it's gotten us is this. That, remember, C1 was an attempt to generalize the initial findings and say they hold quite generally over all transgressions involving harm or not involving harm and so on. It now looks to be the case a little bit by virtue of our new work, but in virtue of much of the other work in the literature as well. Every single member of the first set of conclusions, every single member looks to be false. Well, if that's right, then the second conclusion, which of course depended on the first, the argument from the argument to the conclusion that we've got a natural kind here, depended on the generalization claims. So it looks like we have no reason to believe that that conclusion is true either. So, conclusion, is morality a natural kind? Tentative conclusion I want to offer you, but this isn't quite the end yet. Tentative conclusion is that research involving the moral conventional task gives us no reason to think that the answer is yes. Indeed, I have a much stronger and darker view, which I might as well fess up to about the moral conventional task. I think the moral conventional task is an artifact. I don't think it measures anything interesting to measure, and indeed the reason for that is as soon as you get out of the schoolyard, the results fragment. Okay, but there is a postscript to the talk, and let me spend a few minutes on that, because whenever I give a talk on this topic, particularly focusing on these experiments, people ask, so what are you claiming? Are you claiming that there is no moral conventional distinction? And the answer here is not straightforward. The reason it's not straightforward is it's not entirely clear how that question is best understood. So let me do a few passes, but there are many more. Indeed, you may notice here we're up to slide 88. When it got to tickle 100, I thought, maybe I should stop. Okay, so we can discuss other interpretations in the discussion period. But if the question is, do moral rules and conventional rules constitute natural kinds? The answer is, first of all, that the research using the moral conventional task gives us no reason at all to think the answer is yes. But in the next lecture on, I guess, Friday, I'll sketch a theory about the psychological mechanisms underlying norms, which at least suggests that there is indeed a natural kind in this area, a natural kind of a certain kind of norm, although whether moral rule is an appropriate label for that particular natural kind, if indeed there is one there, is not a straightforward question. It depends to a significant extent on how the term moral rule is ordinarily used. That's not the only thing that determines it, but that's part of what would be involved in the dialectic from the model that I'll show you on Friday, assuming the model is correct, of course, to the claim that there's a natural kind in the area. And interestingly, at present, as we speak, almost nothing is known, at least in a systematic and empirically confirmed way, about how people use terms like moral rule, conventional rule, moral judgment, and so on. However, one of the former students in this august institution and I, Edouard Macheret and I, have a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that we think the usage of the term moral rule, is governed in two ways. It's governed both by a prototype detailing typical reactions to transgressions. So if you're close enough to the prototype, that gets you 1 point in being a moral rule. But secondly, it's independently, and these are additive, we believe, independently governed by a set of exemplars of culturally familiar rules. Okay, so our picture roughly is, you first ask, do you know anything about the reaction to transgressions? Are they prototypical reactions like anger, punishment, and so on? If the answer is yes, you then ask, how close do they match? How close does a transgression match culturally available rules? Okay. Now, if we're right, the theory makes a prediction. It predicts that middle-class, liberal experimental participants will use the term, that is to say, will classify transgressions and rules in ways that are significantly different from, for example, observant Mormons or conservative Muslims or ultra-Orthodox Jews. If our hypothesis is correct, then I think, although I'd be happy to be illuminated on this, it's something we've just begun to think about seriously, if the hypothesis is correct, then I think there's an important sense in which the term moral rule is multiply ambiguous on one interpretation of multiple ambiguity. And there's also an important sense in which there may be no single concept of moral rule, but rather a wide family of them. If that's right, then the traditional project of providing a definition of morality, the project which aims at, as that literature that Alasdair MacIntyre was talking about in the first slide, that linguistic analysis or conceptual analysis literature, that project aims to capture ordinary usage. Well, if the hypothesis that Macheret and I are exploring is right, then I think that entire project, which, remember, MacIntyre tells us was the central project in moral theory at the time, has to be radically reconceived. Well, is our hypothesis right? The answer is that with a bit of luck, I'll be able to offer you some data on my next trip to Paris. And with that, I'll stop.